Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is episode 19 of the Proactive Security Podcast. We are joined by Rick Shaw, who is the author of the First Preventers Playbook. He is a prevention expert and has done a lot of work in putting together strategies for how we intervene, disrupt, and prevent strategy before it strikes. So, Rick, we are super excited to have you on the podcast.
Well, again, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it very much.
Why don't you just start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself and about your background and your work?
Okay. So I guess it's basically related to the book and everything too. I was always one of those little kids that always asked why, so it's like probably drove some people crazy with it. But so I guess that's kind of what got me started down this whole preventers approach, things of, when bad things would happen. And I'd always ask why, even as a kid. And I go back and I talk about this in the book a little bit too, but I talk about how the first preventers part came about later. But even in sixth grade, which you can see my gray hair, that was a long time ago. But in sixth grade, I was kind of this little guy. I'm still not a very big guy now, but a little guy. And a bunch of the students were basically messing with one of the girls, and she was a special needs, special ed girl, and they were bullying her and picking on her, and she'd have seizures. And it was always kind of scary for everybody. And I remember going back and just basically saying, okay, I need to, kind of step in there and prevent this. And so I got in and I recruited some of my other students, friends, and I got the teacher involved. And before long, we had our first preventers, if you will, that kind of stepped in. And I always refer to the girl as MJ, but MJ then, she loved it, appreciated it very much and everything else. I mean, so much so that she used to chase me around then and try to give me kisses and hugs, which was kind of weird in sixth grade, but, it was all good. But I guess, again, it kind of just goes back to early on. I've always been sort of somebody who wants to prevent bad things from happening or things that shouldn't be happening. And so I go back to that. And I also, I learned a valuable lesson, I guess, then too. And over the years, I've learned it even more so. And that is return on prevention is huge. And what I mean by that is that we had our 25th reunion for our class. And so I go in there and there's MJ. And MJ's married and she gives me a big hug, introduced me to her husband. And, it's just big smile. And it's just like, that's kind of that return on prevention, as I like to call it, is that who knows what kind of bad things could have happened, but at least they didn't happen. So that's been something that's always driven me. And even as I got into work and doing other things, I was a white hat hacker for a while, good guy hacker, not bad guy, where we'd go in and look for, holes. And this was way back before all the tools were out there now that you could get on the dark web. But we go and try to, plug the holes, prevent an attack. So even on the cyber side, I've been very focused on prevention, and it sort of just kind of kept going and going and going. And again, after Columbine happened in 1999, I have one daughter, and she was at school age. And so that was another thing that sort of really got me thinking about how do we prevent some of these things from happening, and why are we not preventing them? And that's really what kind of started me on this journey of research, if you will. And so that's kind of what the First Preventers book is all about, is the research I've been doing since basically 99 and even before that, really.
I think it's interesting you talk about that kind of draw to the concept of prevention even early on. And what has always bothered me as I've gotten into healthcare security specifically as an area of focus is the lack of interest in prevention. which I find just incredibly frustrating sometimes. Is we put so much effort in reaction to bad events, in making sure that we get the reaction right, but we fail, or I think miss the opportunity to prevent. And so I'd be curious, given the research that you've done, if you've identified any reasons why we don't invest more in prevention as a violence mitigation strategy.
It's an awesome question because it is frustrating at times. I agree. Matter of fact, I just had last night a discussion on LinkedIn, basically, but it was this guy wrote back to me, says, Rick, this is exhausting trying to get people to understand prevention. He says, how do you do it? But I look at it and I think there's a couple of things. First of all, on the reaction side of the security side of things, I think a lot of people think that is prevention. And again, I'm not saying it's not. I'm not, matter of fact, I call it reactive prevention because it is still prevention because we're reacting to a situation, trying to prevent further loss or further damage or, things like that. But we're still reacting to like maybe a threat that's already there, right? That individual or that workplace violence, that nurse violence. I mean, we're running to that spot to try to de-escalate and prevent further damage, if you will. So I think that there's some confusion. Part of it, Mike, I think, and on your question, I think part of it's just because people think they're preventing, but it's just kind of reactive preventing versus what I like to call proactive preventing, which is really about trying to keep that at-risk individual. And that's just a term I use, but that person that, whether that's a patient or an employee or an ex-employee or, whoever these at-risk individuals might be. But how do we better utilize all those indicators? Because almost always there are indicators beforehand. How do we better utilize those indicators so that we can intervene and disrupt, before they show up, before they escalate to that point, before, they attack or whatever the situation might be. And so I think that it is frustrating at times, no doubt about it. But I think that one of the things I've learned is if we can understand really what prevention is, the reactive versus the proactive, and understand how we also understand, I can get more into it on the book side of it too. But, when I was doing the research, there was I call it the 6 stages of prevention or proactive prevention. And so those 6 stages that I sort of, wasn't that I went looking for those 6 stages. That's just kind of what I discovered, but I think once we understand the 6 stages of prevention, we can also then help people to get on that proactive prevention side of things. Does that kind of answer your question, or does that get to what you were getting at?
Yeah, that kind of hits right on the point. And I think, to some degree, we have to have the events in order to justify ourselves, I think is one of the things that always comes to my mind. And I think that misses the mark. Good security in my mind is when nothing happens. But it's hard to sell nothing happening, right? It's hard to prove that negative, so to speak. And so we need ultimately the prevention to really work towards that goal, to understand what the investment looks like.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, like you said, we need something to happen. And I think that you're right. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not saying we're rooting for a tragedy. I don't mean it that way at all. But I'm just saying that we sort of need some of these things to happen. I think some of the things that have happened more recently, well, even more recently with the Tulsa and some of these other attacks in hospitals, but also Uvalde in the school and things like that, in Buffalo and the grocery store. I mean, we've seen all kinds of different events, but I think what we're starting to see is that the damage can be so horrific. Okay. And it's really wearing on people. So there's that side of it. The other side of it is, as we're seeing with things like maybe Parkland and others, is that we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in liability. And I think that liability cost is also starting to shift the needle, so to speak, or move things over. I mean, when the FBI paid $127.5 million because of Parkland, because they failed to act on the see something, say something reports they received. That's that's a huge shift when the government ends up doing that. So I think that impacts organizations too. They realize that they really have to start being more proactive versus just reactive.
I think that's a good point. So when you talk about then pursuing legitimate prevention, what are some of the things that have come up in your research that are like tangible tools people can put their hands on?
Well, I think first I alluded to that 6 stages. I think people need to kind of understand that first. And the 6 stages are basically collecting the dots. Now I make this all about dots, and I'll explain, like, the dots aren't just informational dots, they're people dots too. So the sources can be dots, the resources can be dots. And so when I say connect the dots, I'm really talking about all kinds of different sources, resources, information, indicators, things like that. But I think we have to, as far as the 6 stages go, you've got collecting the dots, and I'll talk more about these in a second. But then you've got, once you collect them, you have to share them and assess them, right? Somebody has to assess these indicators, warning signs, the individual, the situation, all those things. Once they start assessing it, they can determine, is this a real threat or not a threat, those kind of things. And then they can start connecting the dots, which meaning not only, that may be like a further investigation or a mental health assessment, a behavioral assessment. I mean, some of these kind of things, depending upon the situation. And then moving into connecting it. So you're connecting the dots with some of those resources to do those things. And then also connecting the dots with, like, within an organization, you might have security or EAP or legal or, those kinds of resources that we also need to sometimes get involved. Because when we start connecting the dots, then that's when we can really move into that intervention and disruption phase. Because you really can't do that if you don't know, if you don't have the dots. First of all, it's really hard to intervene. And we see this all the time, because after the fact, all these quote unquote dots get exposed or brought to our attention, if you will. And a lot of people ask, well, why didn't we prevent it if all this information existed, but it was also scattered? And that's really the big problem we see, is that the information gets scattered all over the place. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a second here after I finish my 6 stages. But then there's the prevention stage, is really where the intervention and disruption, obviously. And then you get the prevention stage, is where, the analytics and things like that, what worked, what didn't work, things like that. How do we learn, lessons learned? How do we learn from these things, good and bad? And then the awareness stage. And this is a continuous circle then of the stages. And the awareness stage is, maybe we need to update our policies. Maybe we need to update our strategies. Maybe we need to update our tools. Maybe we need to identify, things change, like the pandemic came. So we have to maybe look for some different indicators now that we didn't used to look for. Things like that. So it's this whole continuum, if you will, of the stages. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the collecting the dots, which is really probably the most, I won't say it's the most important, but you really can't do some of the other ones very well if you don't collect them. And I think in the research, I found this over and over again, and it's just something that I don't think we realize that we're doing to ourselves. And that is that we're creating so many incident reporting options. There's apps, there's texts, there's hotlines, there's hotlines that are community-based, and then there's org-based, and then there's department-based, and then there's, even specialty-based, like ethics or something like that. I mean, I'm not picking on any of these at all. All I'm saying is that we have all these, right? And so when you have all these different options to report to, and then you throw on top of that trusted adults. We always tell people to tell a trusted adult, managers, employees. And all we're doing is basically scattering this information, or these dots, all over the place. Now, again, I'm not trying to be super critical. I don't mean it to sound that way. All I'm saying is that we have to now, because we sort of went in this incident reporting happy phase where we just kept adding all these different things, or here's a new app, here's a new whatever. But now we have to get it back to where we can not only collect them, but basically funnel them and share them to get that process started for the connecting part. Does that make sense? I'll stop there to make sure I don't just keep rambling. But does that make sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So far, no, that's making perfect sense to me. So in terms of collecting the dots, though, now, I guess I'm thinking in terms of an incident, because we want to be proactive, but you almost need something to happen before you realize you need to collect the dots. So I want to get your thoughts on that a little bit more, if we can kind of expand on that.
Like the warning signs and stuff like that, you mean?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so part of the awareness is helping our employees or our customers or our students, or depending on the organization,
Right.
Patients, even in like healthcare, how do we help them to not only, if you quote unquote see something, say something, but where do you say it to? Because if they called the federal see something, say something for your organization, kind of like Parkland, okay, that may not get back to you all to, collected and shared with, not you guys, but I'm just saying, but with the organization, right? And so it's a process of helping people to understand that when they do see something that's concerning or whatever, and we've also discovered in the research, a lot of people don't like to snitch, right? You've always heard that term, snitches get stitches and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
So, I mean, there's tons of barriers, and I'm not going to bore you all with going through all of them, but I'm just saying, but there's tons of barriers along the way. Snitching is a big barrier. Sometimes people don't want to snitch, they don't tell, but yet they know something. And it's like, when you don't know what others know, bad things can happen. And so we've kind of, in the book we talk about, or in the book I talk about, the butterfly effect. And so we've changed the tip line to the butterfly effect, which is one small thing can save a life, save a friend, save a reputation, help someone. It kind of goes back to my 6th grade. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I'm just saying that's, we can help people. And when you turn that to a help from a snitch, it's amazing what we've seen, at least in the data and stuff, how the number of dots that you start collecting go way up, which is good, because the more dots you have, the clearer the picture. That's what we really need. So it's really about trying to not only help people trust how to give you the dots, but where to give you the dots. And again, if you have multiple incident reporting options, that's fine. But let's say you have a hotline. When that call comes in from the hotline, maybe it goes to a third party, but when they collect that information, collect the dots, they do their version of it, they give it to the organization, then what happens to it? Well, a lot of times that's a manual process where somebody tries to email it, or, they have a meeting next week or whatever. That's kind of I would call the conventional approach. Well, the new approach has got to be where you put it into, our approach is to put it into a smart funnel. Okay, so you have to have this funneling capability from all those instant reporting options that exist out there. So you can funnel it in, which then can automatically, in a lot of cases, if you set it up correctly, can automatically then route the notification to the right people. So if it's workplace violence related, it goes to the workplace violence team. If it's weapons related, maybe it may go still to the workplace violence team, but it may also go to your security department, the notification I'm talking about. If it's drug diversion, it may go to a different group of people. Could be some overlaps, obviously, but the idea is that we've got to start, as I mentioned earlier, we've got to get the right information to the right people. And that's really one of the biggest gaps I see out there today. In fact, I call it a gap epidemic, because we've just got so many gaps and barriers out there that we're still trying to address most of them manually. That's what the research shows. And so we try to use that research also to say, how do we prevent that? So we're trying to prevent bad things to help prevent bad things, if that makes sense.
It's interesting you bring up, you're really kind of describing a twofold issue, an overabundance of information, but a lack of knowing the thing you need to know when you need to know it. And so how do we effectively prevent by collecting effective information? And, Brian and I have talked about this on the podcast before. Information is critical. And the more information you have, the more enabled you are to make effective decisions in the context of, preventing any incident, whether it's, a security related incident, a violent incident, whatever that might be. And so, one of the things that I've often wondered is how we create, in the context of the healthcare security professional and the healthcare security industry, a sense of urgency around effective information collection, and how we demonstrate then the efficacy of that. So if you have too much information, that's one problem. But if you're not collecting information, that's a separate problem. But if you're collecting information and you have too much information, but you're not identifying what's important, that's a whole nother issue. And so how do we create a sense of urgency around information collection information dissemination, information processing to create a more effective kind of intelligence program or process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good question. I would say certainly there's the too much, like you mentioned, not enough, like you mentioned. There's also the scattered, is what I'd throw in there too, the scattered information, just because it's across maybe a bunch of supervisors or managers or departments. HR knows this and security knows this, but they don't, about the same person maybe, but they don't both know what the other knows. So it's kind of a combination of that. I would say that to encourage people, though, to help get that trust and to help people to collect with the collection of dots, is that, again, in research wise, a lot of people will say, well, I told them, or I told whoever, I told a manager, I reported it, I did whatever, and nothing happened. And so a lot of times people then quit reporting. So it's maybe, I'm oversimplifying here without getting into the gory details of all the different ways it could go and all the barriers. But a lot of times the reason nothing happened is because maybe they did tell a manager, that manager may have thought they fixed it in that moment, but they don't see what else is happening maybe later in the day, on a different shift, on social media, all these other things, right? And so the perception still is nothing changed for the person who reported it, or the person who's experiencing workplace violence, for example. And so when nothing happens, people quit reporting and they take matters in their own hands sometimes. And we don't want that either, because that can get ugly. Or they internalize it, and then we have some, things even like suicide or drugs, things like that too. I mean, there's just all kinds of different consequences that we don't want. So it really comes back to help with the collection, we have to build that trust, and we have to eliminate that snitching thing. We have to make sure that there's action taken. And that's the beauty of making sure that when it comes into this funnel I'm talking about, it's kind of if you kind of just envision a smart funnel, when the smart funnel, when you put it in there, whether it's coming from the manager or from whoever, when it gets routed to the right team members, if those team members will take some sort of action, and then people see that action was taken, especially if they're trying to help someone, that they know somebody's, maybe they're being a jerk at work, but maybe it's because they're going through a bad situation at home, right? And so we're trying to get them help. And if we can, when people see that, then we see an increase in dot collection because people are seeing results. Does that make sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, results always produce, more buy-in. That's always going to be the kind of key. And I think, that goes back to what we discussed a little bit earlier, where, with security, sometimes it's hard because you're trying to prove a negative. The lack of quote unquote results equates to an effective security program. And that's one of the challenges that we often see. You mentioned earlier, you used the term, your return on prevention. Could you elaborate a little bit on that concept?
Yeah, so return on prevention is something, and again, it's not always easy to, like you said, it's not always easy to prove or show that, something was going to take place but didn't. It's kind of hard to always show that. But at the same time, you can take like parallel examples, if you will, or similar examples. And in other words, you might see, like you might have in the healthcare world, you might have a patient who's really ticked off at their doctors, have a lot of pain. Well, you could look at Tulsa and say, and I'm not saying I understand all the details, but I'm just saying those are some of the things we've seen so far. But you might have a situation that might be similar to another tragedy that took place. So the idea of return on prevention is to look at some of the things that have happened, or some of the lawsuits that have taken place, or some of the fines that have taken place, or some of the, the reputational damage, or people who have lost their jobs and things like that. Use some of those to kind of help your organization understand that return on prevention means we don't experience these things. Okay. And the only way we don't experience these things, though, is if we are proactively collecting, assessing, and connecting the dots, so that our team members, our care team, or, they have a lot of different names, but the different teams can actually do what they need to do. And so return on prevention really is, like you said, it's hard to prove maybe that, well, nothing happened, But yet at the same time, I think we can all agree these days that every organization has at-risk individuals, people who are struggling with stressors, people who have grievances, people who are, disgruntled, people who have lost loved ones because of pandemic or whatever. And so I think we have to kind of change this return on prevention, is that how are we going to help these people? Because even, and I don't mean even, I'm just saying, but like a suicide, if a suicide takes place, and we've seen some of those take place in healthcare, and not just healthcare, but other places, but we've seen some of those take place. If we can prevent one of those, I mean, look at the headlines that that goes out, and it's just not good. It's not good for your reputation and things like that. So, it's even like reputation. How do you put a value on reputation? It can take, what do they say, 25 years to build it and 5 minutes or less to ruin it or whatever. So, but again, it's that kind of idea that we have to be able to show hey, we have some of the same challenges this other organization had, or maybe even we've had a previous near miss. Okay. We lucked out, but we didn't prevent it. We just lucked out. You can use some of those things to show how, when we don't have these things, and the return on prevention for me with MJ was just that, getting that hug and that smile, and, just basically her being happy. I mean, so I don't know if I can put a dollar sign on it. I don't think I can, but I'm just saying, but I know inside that return on prevention goes way further down the road, many years, than return on regret for not doing something. Because return on regret can be a lifetime too. But it could be, something horrible would have happened to MJ. I would have felt really bad.
I like the way you kind of juxtapose those ideas, the return on prevention and the return on regret. I think it is sometimes hard to put dollar signs on what you produce when you do effective prevention. But I do think there is a clear delineation between, a lucky near miss and an effective prevention. And that does need to be something that we are able to articulate more effectively, I think, as healthcare security professionals, for sure. Well, Rick, these are fantastic concepts. If any of our listeners wanted to get more Rick Shaw in their life, how do they do that?
Well, there's a couple different ways. The First Preventers Playbook. Thank you. I see that on the screen there. You can definitely go to Amazon and get that. You can go out to, there's a couple things. rickshawprevents.com is sort of my personal webpage. You can go out there. You can get a link to the book from there as well. Some of my research is out there as well. Some of the things that went into this book, but some of the other things that other research I've done also. That's probably the best place to get a hold of me directly. You can definitely go out to awareity.com. That's the company. I have two companies, just so everybody knows. You'll see it on Rick Shaw Prevents also, but the for-profit is awareity.com, and the nonprofit is firstpreventers.org. And firstpreventers.org is a 501c3. We are really doing some, it's sort of emerging right now, but we're really doing some interesting things. We've got some, I call them elite experts. Some of these guys are former FBI HRT, if you're familiar with the HRT group, the hostage rescue team. I kid them, and luckily I can do this. They're cool. But a couple of them, I welcome over from the dark side of response to the bright side of prevention. And again, I'm not trying to make light of it. It's very serious stuff. But we're building a group of experts so we can go out and basically help more organizations to really understand the difference between proactive prevention and reactive prevention, or just prevention and response, depending upon how you want to look at it. There's multiple ways you can get out there, awareity.com or rickshawprevents.com or firstpreventers.org.
Okay, and perfect. The other thing I wanted to highlight too was the Rickisms that I captured from today. So we have return on prevention, reactive prevention, and gapidemic. So I like all of those.
Yeah, thanks on the gapidemic one. I mean, it's like we have an epidemic of violence.
Yep.
Right? And we have a gapidemic of silos. And these silos are leading to these gaps, which is the gapidemic. you know, you can stress one thing, it's just that we all have silos. It's not like we can, you know, try to defend them or whatever. And we'll always have silos. I mean, it's just the way departments are. It's the way systems are. It's the way, you know, incident reporting systems are going to have silos. It's not like we're going to eliminate, quote unquote, all the silos or make them all into one. But what we can start doing is connecting the silos. And to me, that's what's really missing out there when we look at case after case or incident after incident, or even things like, you know, OSHA fines or something like that, is that usually it was somebody knew that something here, somebody else knew something here, and somebody else knew something here, but the silos didn't know what each silo knew. And that's what we can do a lot better, for sure.
Well, I can definitely agree that there are a lot of silos in a healthcare organization. So there's plenty of opportunity and gaps to be addressed. Rick, I can't thank you enough for being here, man. Glad to have you on the show, and glad to get some of those Rickisms out in the world.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for the invite. I appreciate it, guys. And it was a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, Rick, thank you for joining us. Again, just reiterating what Mike said. And for the rest of you out there who tuned in, we just encourage you to stay proactive.